G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Nick and this is Nutrition. In today's video, I'm joined by some fellow coaches where we discuss and hopefully put to bed some pretty common nutrition myths. Earlier in 2020, right at the start of the lockdown, I was part of a huge online fitness event called COVID-19. This is a recording of the Nutrition Myths talk that I was a part of. I'm going to leave all the information for the other coaches in the description below. If throughout the talk you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you, or I'll get in touch with the other coaches and see if some of them can get back to you. Now this video is a pretty long one, so I'm going to keep the intro short, but please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, maybe even share it with a friend. Here's the video.
There we go. So, bit of intro for people that are just joining. Maybe you maybe you're with us for the Dan Meredith talk. Maybe you've just joined specifically for this one. Let's give you a bit of an overview about what we're talking about. Now, this one is all about busting nutrition myths. Now, we are all evidence-based nutritionists type peoples that are coming onto this sort of thing. So we're going to endeavor to give you the real truth when it comes to lots of the nutrition information that you've been hearing, seeing, and experiencing all across social media. Now, we've got a few of the common ones and we've planned to talk through those. But if there are some nutrition myths that you're unsure about and you want some clarification or our opinion, then feel free to add those in live and we will start to work our way through those as well. But without further ado, let us start with Mr. Big Nick, as we are going to affectionately refer to him as. I don't know whether the big is to do with the size of the man or the beard or both, and as an amalgamation of the two, but generally big. So let's talk about protein, Nick. There is a myth or a phrase or a belief in some people that you can only absorb 30 grams of protein in one meal. Is this true or is this false?
This is false. Basically, if you could only absorb 30 grams of protein per meal, then everything you ate beyond that, so all the protein you ate beyond that, would not count. It wouldn't get absorbed, you would shit it out, and you would essentially have free calories, right? We all know that doesn't happen. So you do absorb it. Is it useful? That's kind of more independent to the person consuming it. So as Mark and I spoke yesterday on the muscle gain lecture, I keep saying lecture, roundtable, we were talking about different protein sources and how much was needed to hit your leucine threshold. And from whey, so the gold standard of protein, is 0.3 grams per kilo of body weight. If you have 0.3 grams per kilo of body weight and you're 100 kilograms, that would be 30 grams of protein. But that is what you need to hit your leucine threshold. You could still go beyond that and still provide more amino acids to your body, and they would get used for other things. Maybe you would you would initiate muscle protein synthesis and you would get that muscle full effect and then not actually use any more of those amino acids for muscle protein synthesis. But that's not the only thing amino acids are used for in the body. It could be some organ repair. That's not muscle protein synthesis. That would be, depending on the organ, but a different type of protein synthesis. We spoke yesterday a little bit about collagen protein synthesis. There's a whole bunch of things that happen in the body. And they're not like, muscle isn't the only function for amino acids. So even if 30 grams is all you needed to saturate hit leucine threshold and saturate muscle protein synthesis, there would still be use for the other protein. Now, if you went to a different source of protein, if you went to a mixed meal, you might be around the 0.4 to 0.5 grams per kilo of body weight. Again, if you're 100 kilos, that's 40 to 50 grams of protein per meal. So straight away there, we're already above the 30 grams. And that's so me being 110 kilos, I need, if it's a really mixed meal or if it's no animal sources, I probably need up to like 55 grams per meal just to hit leucine threshold and even initiate muscle protein synthesis. So if I only had 30 grams per meal, I would probably, I guess you still initiate muscle protein synthesis, but definitely not to its fullest extent. And I'll definitely be leaving gains on the table. So is 30 grams a limit? No. For many people, especially if you're a bigger person, that might be the target that you need to hit and then exceed. But yeah, it depends on the source. It depends on how big you are. Even if you're 50 kilos, you still need to be eating a certain amount of protein. If it's a mixed meal, it might still be more than 30 grams. So yeah, it's a big old false on that one.
Awesome. I need one of those like family fortune things. That I need that. Maybe the next time we do this. Right, next one we're going to go to Mark. Now, Mark, we thought about one of the questions being around starvation mode, and that's actually come in live. So why don't we tackle that one straight away? Cameron says, what is your view on the term of starvation mode as the principle that if you don't consume enough calories, that your body starts to store more fat instead? So, Mark, what's your opinion on starvation mode?
Yeah, so starvation mode gets thrown around a lot, even by quite high up people, but it depends what they mean by it. So there is like a lot of these myths, kind of a grain of truth or a bit of logic behind it. But if starvation mode was a thing, how it's stated on this question, we wouldn't have people starving all around the world. So unfortunately, it is false. Now, the kind of grain of truth behind it is when we do diet and lose weight, we enter something called adaptive thermogenesis, or most people do. So if I was 80 kilograms and I, over 5 years, put on 20 kilograms, got to 100 kilograms, let's say when I was 80 kilograms, my BMR was around 2,000 calories. When I got to 100 kilograms, it's going to be a lot more. Now, let's say I wanted to diet back down to 80 kilograms. The chances are my metabolism wouldn't be 2,000 calories again. I would have entered adaptive thermogenesis. For most people, we lose anywhere between 0 to 20%. So it could be kind of like 1,800 calories, 1,700 calories. So it will be a little bit lower. In certain conditions such as PCOS, we can see that go up to kind of 30, even 40% in extreme cases. So there is a grain of truth behind it. But we don't go into starvation mode where we just hold on to fat and can't lose any more weight. Quite a few studies have been kind of shown to support this. One of my favorite ones, it's not a hugely reliable study. It's an N=1 study, but I'm sure you all know it, the AB study. So there's a guy, I think he was around 282 kilograms. So really, really, really overweight. Over 380 days or something similar to that, he didn't eat anything. So he went on a therapeutic fast. He didn't eat anything. He was given kind of intravenous vitamins, I think electrolytes to keep his kind of deficiencies away. And by 380 odd days, he had lost 125 kilograms, which equaled about 0.8 pounds per day he was losing. And the funny thing about this is a lot of people think, oh, that's extreme. It's extreme. It is extreme, very extreme. Wouldn't recommend it. But he, 5 years later, only put on about 5 or 7 kilograms. I think it was 7 kilograms. So he was 89 kilograms. So starvation mode isn't a thing. Otherwise, that definitely wouldn't happen. Another really famous study, the Ansel Keys, Minnesota starvation study. They had loads of, I think it was like 400 men volunteer to basically be semi-starved, just so they could see, as in World War II, see how people would respond after coming from almost like a famine. They dieted anywhere between 800 to 1,500 calories, I think. I'm not sure quite on the figure. They got them increasing their NEAT up to kind of 22 miles a week. And over 6 months, they all lost around 25% of their body weight. So they didn't go into starvation mode, even though their calories were really, really low. They just carried on losing weight. So it's not a thing. If you do get to a point of getting to adaptive thermogenesis and your metabolism's gone down to kind of maintenance again, you either have to reduce calories further, which for some people isn't ideal. So other than that, you can just increase your kind of energy expenditure or a bit of both. But yeah, unfortunately, one of those family fortune ringers again.
Indeed. And I think that if you put that like logical thought experiment on one step further, is that if starvation mode was a thing, no one would die of starvation. Because you'd all retain body fat, that process would stop. But we know that, there are, like you said,
number one death, I think.
Say again?
I think it's the number one death in the world, hunger, isn't it?
There you go. So, you wouldn't have this sort of, and, anorexia wouldn't be a thing because the body would sort of kick in and do something else. So as Mark says, there is this process whereby your body starts to adapt to the lower calories you give it. Maybe you downregulate some activity and things like that. Subconsciously, maybe if you're not tracking steps, subconsciously you're more lethargic, you move less, maybe you're less energetic in the gym, and all of that can turn what was once a deficit into maintenance. And then you have to make some adjustments. And like Mark says, you can have some adjustments to your energy in or energy out, or you could possibly look at a diet break or something like that, and use various different strategies to help you keep progressing. But no, starvation mode isn't a thing. So, question's done. Just a quick one there. Apparently, Nick, your beard is kinky. So there we go. Jayne, we're going to move on to you. So let's talk about quote unquote junk food. So there will be people that follow like a clean eating thing, and therefore you can't eat junk food because and still lose body fat because that's what's going to kind of keep it hanging around, and everything has to be this clean approach, and you can eat as much of that as you like because it's all great and good for you.
Okay, so this has kind of got some layers to it, like different aspects of it that I kind of want to touch on. Like first and foremost, it's like the idea of clean eating is a bit of a bugbear of mine anyway. It's like quite disempowering for people. It implies that certain foods are bad or wrong or dirty and shouldn't be eaten. So that's the first kind of fact that I'd like to touch on. It's like that junk food is bad or wrong or something like that. But looking at this, we're going to take into account the fact that junk food means highly processed foods, like really highly processed foods, like your cakes, biscuits, sweets, and stuff like that. And that's what we're talking about. And the easy answer to this is yes, you can eat junk food and still lose body fat and still lose weight. It's not an issue to do so once energy balance is in check. Once you are consuming less calories than you need, you're going to lose body fat. So it's irrelevant of what the food source is. Once your calories are in check, once you're in a deficit, you are going to lose body fat. However, is it optimal to do it with an entirely junk food-based diet? No, it's not. Your health is going to be compromised. And there's a difference between just losing weight and body fat. If you are not optimizing your micro and macronutrients, your health is going to be compromised, which means you're potentially going to lose muscle as well if you're not getting protein in and good quality sources of protein. Your energy levels are going to be compromised if you're not getting enough vitamins and minerals and micronutrients and lots of veggies and fruit and legumes and fiber in your diet to keep your health optimized, which is hugely important. As well as that, the problem with junk food is, particularly if you are dieting, while you can include any food within your diet, like depending on context, junk food, like that kind of highly processed food, is really, really palatable. It's hyper palatable. It's very easy to overconsume. It does tend to drive that urge to overeat a little bit for some people. So it is something to be conscious of if you are having quite a lot of it in your diet and you are trying to lose body fat. It doesn't satiate you in the same way as whole foods do, like as high protein foods, your vegetables, your whole grains. So that's a consideration too. So I think the clear rounding it up kind of answer to it is, no food is inherently bad or wrong. You can include all kinds of food, junk food or highly processed food in moderation for health. If you are optimizing your protein, getting lots of vitamins and minerals from vegetables, fruit and things like that, as the majority of your diet, then you're going to optimize health. But you want to be able to support the process of fat loss by optimizing your health. So yeah, you could do it, but it's not advisable. Do it with an entirely junk food based diet. And eating entirely clean is not advised either, because you're missing out on so much fun foods and balance. And if you really enjoy a little junk food every now and then, it's going to make it easier to sustain a diet and live.
And I think go ahead.
Just to add to what Jayne said about whether it's the healthy way to do it or not, whether you're losing weight, junk food, or clean eating or whatever, they actually did a study on this and compared all highly processed food and all non-processed food. I believe it was Kevin Hall, and it was something like 20 adults in a metabolic ward. So they controlled for all food intake and all energy output. And over the period of time, everybody in one group was given all unprocessed food, and another group was given all processed food, and they matched every macronutrient, every calorie, and even palatability. So it wasn't like one group was given burgers and one group was given salads. Like, they matched for palatability. So they tried to make the food taste really good, even in the unprocessed food. And so with all these things matched, they then did the study again and swapped the groups around. So this group that had the junk food or the unprocessed food had the processed food, and vice versa. And it turned out that both groups ended up eating more every day, just eating the processed food, even though all those things were matched, by a matter of about 500 calories each. So that was on average 500 calories, within about 100 calories of that. So somewhere between 400 and 600 calories was the overconsumption of food, just based on the fact that the food they were eating was all highly processed versus not processed at all. So even if it was a healthy way to lose weight, it would make it much, much harder to lose weight just by including those ultra-processed foods.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're made to taste extra good to drive us to want to keep going back to them time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
Like they've made a point of creating foods like that to sell them, to make them really hyper palatable.
And I think just one thing I was going to add on that was, I can't remember which talk it was from. They're all a blur. So we started talking about like the gray area in the middle is often the right answer to many different questions, but it's not necessarily the sexy answer that everyone wants to hear. And like Jayne was saying, is that whilst you don't have to eliminate junk food or highly processed food, whatever is the right label for it, you don't want to then just divert immediately to another extreme that's now all I'm going to eat, and disregard everything else, because you could get some form of unhealthy relationship by feeling that every food has to be quote unquote clean, whatever that means, and then you could equally have an unhealthy diet or an unhealthy relationship with food by just ignoring micronutrients and all that sort of stuff completely as well. So often it's the case of finding good balance in the middle, and that's much more difficult thing to say, because what's the right balance? Well, there's no definitive don't eat this, don't eat that. It becomes that more sort of gray area type of thing. So I think that's kind of what I was gonna add, is that yes, the answer may be a strict no, but like Jayne was saying, there's more color to the answer than a black and white no.
Well, clean eating does kind of mask disordered eating for some people who get really into it, like orthorexia. It's like, I'm eating clean all the time, but it's just another way to control their eating, and it becomes an unhealthy obsession on being healthy, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So when it gets to that point, sorry, Jayne. Sorry, Karen.
No,
I was going to say, when it gets to that point as well, you mentioned if you do completely go to the junk food and eat all of that, you are going to get some micronutrient deficiencies. But if you go completely to that clean side as well, and you're just eating like a very limited amount of foods, you can still quite easily enter kind of nutrient deficiency. So it is important to try and have a really wide balance and not just get kind of dichotomous on certain clean foods.
And there was I can't remember who it was. So someone I follow on Instagram put up a Instagram story of a TV program that was on the BBC where he's a presenter on MasterChef. Can't remember his name. Bald guy, glasses. He said you could. I'm eating clean or I'm eating healthy food, and his literally the words out of his mouth is, and you can eat as much of it as you want. His literally words out of his mouth. National TV for all you people watching this program or that program. So the belief that you could eat as much as you like is horrendously false. Mm-hmm. Now, yes, you should have a highly nutritious diet full of lots of diverse ranges of fruits, vegetables, and all that sort of good stuff, but it all has calories. So it comes back to that fundamental principle that, energy balance matters if you're trying to manage your weight in some way, shape, or form. So yes, there's a lot of different takes on that question, but it's important to understand that the answer is you can eat junk food, but don't make that exclusively what you eat, I would say. Cool. So let's throw in a couple of live questions. I'm just going to pick people at random. Nick, I think you're next up. So there you go. I don't know how you pronounce that. Sorsani? I don't know. Whatever. Is it okay if I don't hit my daily protein goal, but rather hit a weekly protein goal? Does it matter? We kind of touched on that in Muscle Game, but do you want to kind of repeat for the people that maybe missed it?
Yeah, of course. Is it okay? I mean, it's okay to do whatever you like, but is it optimal? No. If you want to optimally hit your protein target and then therefore have all the benefits that come with hitting your protein target, you're best off doing it per day. And then to go even further, it would be even more optimal to do it per meal. Your body, everyone says your body can't store protein. It kind of can, but it stores it as muscle. And most people don't want to sacrifice muscle. Their goal is to either have more or retain what they have. So to actually keep that muscle, you need to be getting enough protein in each day that your body doesn't go, shit, I need amino acids. Oh, here's a store right here I'm going to get. And then your shoulders shrink or your pecs shrink or whatever. It's not that drastic, but essentially that is the store of amino acids you have in your body. It's your muscle mass. And if you don't provide your body with enough amino acids in the form of protein, dietary protein, then it will take it from somewhere else. So keeping the adequate amount of protein coming in each day is very important, because if you don't, your body will take it from somewhere else. But your protein target, depending where it is, may be beyond the minimum anyway. Like you can, I think the very, very minimum would be like 1.2 grams per kilo. But to keep it safe, if you were at like 1.6 grams per kilo and beyond, anything beyond that, you would still be fine to like lower it for whatever reason. Whatever the reason is, you want to not eat as much protein that day. As long as you keep it above 1.6 grams of protein per kilo of body weight, you will probably be fine.
Perfect. Cool. And I think Charlotte touched on it in one of the Q&As about one particular study where, like you say, Nick, you can go even in a calorie deficit down to like 1.2 and still, as long as you're doing some form of resistance training, maintain your muscle mass. Yep. I guess if the goal is to build muscle mass, that then wouldn't be optimal. Yeah. But if the broad range, especially maybe in current climate, is to maintain, then understand that you've got a very broad range to work within if only the goal is to maintain muscle. So again, maybe don't think about stressing out about hitting high amounts of protein. Again, a couple of the questions that we've had come through is, well, how do I get all this protein in if the shops are all empty of protein? Well, maybe take the stress off of trying to hit such a high protein target would be one way to go about it. But definitely, as you say, daily rather than weekly is the preferable way to go about it.
Yeah, optimal is important. Sorry, optimal is important, but that would be absolutely perfect. Like if this is optimal, there's all this distance here to absolutely garbage, and everyone would sit somewhere in the middle here. And the closer you get to optimal, the better, obviously. But as long as you're not sitting at absolutely garbage, which is a scientific term, might I add, as long as you're not sitting at absolutely garbage, you are going to be making some sort of progress. But the more factors you have against you, like say, for example, you can't train, then you need to be getting closer to optimal with your diet. Say, for example, you're older, you'd be considered an elderly person. Then you've got these factors against you. You need to start working towards optimal. So the more things that aren't ideal with your current situation, whatever those things are, that are taking you away from optimal, then you need to be pushing other areas that you can control up towards optimal. So for somebody who's like 21 and has a home gym and parents buy all their food for them during these times, then they can probably stand to not worry about how much protein they get per meal because they're probably hitting it per day. Someone who's older and maybe can only be body weight training at home and doesn't have access to all the protein they're after, maybe needs to be thinking about these smaller, like the minutiae of these things to try and get a little closer to optimal.
And just for clarification, Nick class is old as 30. So there you go.
I was just thinking that. I was like, over 30, yeah?
You're never going to live this down. You're never going to get a client over 30 now.
I'm 30 as well.
Cool. So, right, we've got a question coming in about starvation mode. So maybe, actually, is that the one I've just covered? That's the one I've covered. There was another question about starvation mode. There it is. So, Mark, maybe we go to you. Is it a case of lean muscle loss during starvation or starvation settings? I'm assuming that means an aggressive calorie deficit that contributes to the myth whereby body composition shows a false increase in body fat as opposed to actual amount. So I assume that they're meaning that is it the fact that there's a highly calorie deficit? Is it then having more muscle loss, which appears to have an increase in body fat?
Yeah, again, not really. It's actually a lot harder to lose muscle than people think. I think we went over this yesterday briefly, but in the Longland study that I think was brought up in a previous lecture, maybe by Charlotte, where they had a diet, I can't remember, I think it's 25%, you guys might be able to correct me, 25% deficit, and they had a control group at 1.2 grams per kilogram. So not a huge amount of protein. And then I had another group at 2.7 grams. The 2.7 grams, it might be 2 grams per kilogram. But anyway, those guys gained quite a bit of muscle, and 1.2 grams even maintained muscle. So even in a deficit at 1.2 grams per kilogram, we're still able to maintain muscle. They were kind of experienced athletes coming out of kind of off season, so there is a few issues with that, but there have been other studies to show the same. So even if you were losing muscle, you wouldn't be losing that amount to realize, to make it look like you're going into starvation mode and change your body composition drastically, unless it was over maybe like a year or something and you weren't training. So no, I wouldn't say so.
Cool. One thing in that study that they made sure of was that they were still doing the other things towards optimal. So that muscle gain triad that I mentioned yesterday in the muscle gain roundtable, if you weren't there, it's on my Instagram. But they took away one thing, so they took away the energy, but they kept training and they kept sufficient protein, and therefore were able to maintain. But yeah, that's what I was talking about yesterday. If they took away, training, they would still be able to maintain with sufficient protein, sufficient energy. So it's, as long as something like those things are sufficient, you can usually get away without losing any muscle.
Yeah, I think it mainly, sorry, Simon, I think it mainly comes from the adaptive thermogenesis and the fact that even when we lose weight, naturally our metabolism will go down anyway, even without adaptive thermogenesis, because we weigh less and there's less energy to burn throughout the day. So I think that's where it mainly comes from, not so much for kind of muscle loss.
And I think from research, I've seen that basically, unless you're already like super lean and you're in an aggressive calorie deficit, maybe that low protein intake, maybe you're going to get then some muscle loss in that situation. So there are always, I guess, extremes, but for the majority of people watching this right now, you're not really kind of borderline comp prep and then thinking about massively lowering your protein intake right now. So it's probably not relevant, but
yeah, most of the time when people look in the mirror and they're like, oh, I've lost muscle in, these 2 weeks of isolation, it's purely just that they've lost maybe the glycogen stores, maybe they're not storing as much water, maybe they stopped taking creatine because they ran out or something. Like it's probably something else that's leading to the muscle being less full, but they still have the same muscle fibers. They're probably just training it differently, or their diet's changed a little bit, and it just doesn't look as big as it did before.
Cool. We'll take another live question. Jayne, maybe as the female within the group here, the myth that women get bulky by lifting weights. Now, if you've ever seen Jayne's Instagram stories, she loves a barbell or two. So, she won't mind me saying she doesn't look bulky. So what's your take on that, Jayne?
You are not going to touch a weight and suddenly turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger. That stuff takes a really, really, really long period of time. Trust me, lifting weights for a while. Muscle gain is not something that happens overnight. Your training is hugely important. Your type of training, how long you're training. Also, a massive factor is genetics too, like how you develop muscle, where you develop, and your training history matters massively. Like, people compare themselves to people they see online who've probably been training their whole lives, who probably have a sports background, who have been training those muscles, women who have been athletes their entire life, who have been working to gain that muscle. It takes a lot of time. Your diet has to be optimized. You obviously have to be getting sufficient protein, hitting leucine threshold, focused on muscle gain. Lifting weights will get you stronger. Lifting weights will give you more lean body mass. It will help you get leaner. It'll help you look aesthetically leaner. A lot of women get concerned that because they might weigh a little bit more sometimes if they've gained muscle, that they suddenly look bigger. But usually you're going to look leaner. You're going to look tighter. That toned effect that I hate kind of using that term, but it's like, it's the truth. That's what everyone knows it as. That's muscle. That's lean muscle mass. And you're going to get that from resistance training. The look everybody thinks they want is achieved by lifting weights or by doing some form of resistance training. You get that look that you see of people with really, really larger muscles that they've developed over time. Takes time, takes specific training, takes genetics, sometimes takes the assistance of other factors as well. But you're not going to get bulky from lifting weights. I personally believe you will get more awesome by lifting weights. And mentally, it just makes you feel awesome.
It says you'll get awesome weights. There you go. Do it.
That's probably why I'm so awesome, because I definitely don't look like Arnie.
I'm very awesome.
Lifting weights enable you to grow the beard, Nick.
The beard, yeah.
Actually, I couldn't lift weights until I had the beard.
See.
Yeah.
Like Samson, how is it? If you cut the beard, would that just all the gains would just melt?
Yeah,
Like
the longer it gets, the stronger I get. Longer equals stronger.
There you go. Awesome.
And I'd also say,
Okay.
in the gym, you could see 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds training 5 times a week at the peak of their testosterone, and they're still not, overnight turning into Arnie. It does take a long time. So if you look at them at the peak of their testosterone, females naturally do have a lot lower testosterone. It is going to be harder to, turn into Arnie overnight. So, and you can get to a point where you're just like, okay, I'll stop there. It's not going to happen. You're not going to wake up with like massive shoulders and bulging biceps, unfortunately.
It's not like you went to the Zoltar machine and, said, oh, I want to be big. And then overnight you jack. It's like, it'll be a case of you can still go to the gym and maintain. We talked about on the physique development Q&A about what amount of training volume would just maintain a muscle group's muscle mass. At the point where you look in the mirror and say, you know what, quads are big enough, that'll do. You can just pull that then down to maintenance volume and just enjoy your training from that perspective. It's not going to be shit. Where did that quad come from? I wish it was like that, but it's not.
Can you imagine how shit it would be if, as soon as women touch weights, they got bulky, but men were as they are now and can't get massive even though they lift heaps? It's the exact opposite of what everyone wants.
I think that quite clearly women would rule the world at that point and be required as a thing, because we would
be kept underground and farmed for our semen.
Something like that. Quickly on from the semen chat. Mark, fasted cardio. So fasted cardio, a lot of people will think that that's potentially beneficial for fat loss because you're waking up in the morning, you haven't eaten anything, therefore you do some exercise, body is then going to go straight to those fat stores, lose weight faster, therefore is that a thing?
Again, a very small grain of truth, like many of these myths, but no, not completely true at all. So when we do, let's say, first thing in the morning, go to the gym, we train at a low intensity, we will be oxidizing more fat at that point. Does have to be at low intensity because we can't oxidize fat at high intensity. So let's say people are doing their kind of jog in the morning for an hour. At that point, they'll oxidize more fat than if they were to go to the gym, have breakfast, go to the gym, and then do exactly the same thing. They'd be much more likely to burn more glycogen in that time. But that's in an acute setting. So if you look out, most of the studies that did this were over 24 hours. So they saw that and they're like, oh yeah, look, they're kind of oxidizing more fat. So they're obviously going to burn more fat, or lose more fat. But that's not the case. So when we look at fat loss, it's longitudinal. So I think Brad Schoenfeld did a 4-week study. There has been a study since this. I can't remember who did it, but Brad did a 4-week one, and they had people doing fasted against kind of fed state, but they had calories matched, and surprise, surprise, they lost the same amount of weight or maintained the same amount of weight. I can't remember what it was, but there was no difference between groups because, as we all know, hopefully, that calories do count. So if that wasn't the case, it'd completely undermine calorie balance, and that isn't the case. But that's not to say you can't do it, of course. If you wake up and you just don't get hungry, by all means, go for it. Some people say they do perform better. By all means, if that's the case, go for it. I'm not one to do it because I get hungry straight away. I'm always hungry. But another reason would be if you were to actually try and do something like intermittent fasting, or you're just trying to restrict a window of eating. If you were to go to the gym for kind of an hour, have an hour to get change, and then go home half an hour, that's already 2.5 hours into your day. So you've kind of shortened that period of time to overconsume calories. So that could be one benefit of maybe doing it. But in acute setting, you'll oxidize more fats. So your triglycerides will kind of convert into free fatty acids. But over long term, if your calories are in a surplus, they'll go straight back in. If they're in a deficit, then it'll be equal. But yeah, so oxidation, I think the key is acute oxidation or fat oxidation doesn't always equal fat loss. So I think that's where most people get mistaken.
Cool.
Hope that makes sense.
Does indeed. So for fasted cardio, stay in bed if you don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Do it when it's convenient if you have to do it at all. Nick, we're going to pull in a live question for you, which is it healthy to eat 2 eggs a day to hit your protein goal, or is it too much fat and cholesterol?
It is not too much fat and cholesterol. I was going to say it is healthy, but I guess that's context specific. It's very, very unlikely that 2 eggs is going to put you over your daily intake of cholesterol or fat. And it will just put you towards your protein goal. I mean, eggs aren't unhealthy. All that cholesterol garbage is pretty much gone now, right? I mean, the vegans still bang on about it, but they bang on about any thread that they can grab onto, they'll bang on about it. But yeah, it's healthy. It's enough. It's fine. If you have your own issues with eggs, don't eat them. But if you like them and you want to eat them, they won't do you any harm.
And I think like the broad guidelines on fats in your diet in general will be just maybe having a broad range and not being highly skewed one way or the other to, say, for example, not skewing your diet to have a huge amount of saturated fat and not much of other types of fat.
Yep.
So try to keep everything nicely balanced. So maybe a diet that is all butter and bacon is probably not ideal. Maybe coming back to, again, like what Jayne was saying about junk foods and clean foods and having some balance. Again, it's going to be somewhere in there. So not highly skewing towards saturated fat, but maybe keeping a nice broad balance across those different types of fat, I think would be a sensible way to approach things.
Yeah, definitely. You could even go further into the types of fat. And so eggs come from chickens, which are fed on grain. So the majority of the fat in an egg is going to be omega-6. and your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio can be important for health if you're eating a lot of omega-6 rich foods and not much omega-3 rich foods. So if you find you're getting a lot of your fats from grain sources or eggs or even dairy and meat, then probably consider adding in some fatty fish and supplementing that for a different fatty source of protein.
Happy days. Jayne, we're going to bring in another live question for you. Noon. So Noon follows me on Instagram. I see her pop up on my lives every now and again. So I recognize some of these usernames and faces and things like that. So, hey guys, just tuned in. Sorry if you've already covered this. We haven't. But can you please talk about insulin makes you fat myth? Thanks in advance. Insulin makes you fat.
This is a pretty common myth. I think that we've all probably had people believe this one. And again, as like Mark has been saying, a lot of these have a thread of truth, kind of truth running through them. And with insulin, the idea is that you eat carbohydrates, it increases your insulin levels, which promotes the storage of fat because it down regulates fat oxidation. However, when it does spike as well, while you're not oxidizing fat in the same way, it upregulates carbohydrate oxidation. So it all balances out in the end. And what people don't realize it's like the insulin hypothesis made simple, I think I just tried to do there. People don't realize that there's other foods that are also quite insulinemic, like dairy, which is not a carbohydrate source. And that also spikes insulin. Insulin spiking after eating is not something that we have to be concerned about. It's quite a natural function that happens when we eat, particularly when we eat certain foods. So yeah, insulin does not make you fat, while spiking insulin does downregulate our fat oxidation. It upregulates carb oxidation, and it all balances out is probably the simple way to put it.
Yeah, I think about the dairy there. So I think we touched on it yesterday in one of the talks, is that whey protein is going to sufficiently spike insulin post-workout so that you don't necessarily need carbohydrates in your post-workout nutrition to have that benefit. So there is lots of nuance to this as well. And I always, again, like I've talked a couple of times now about little thought experiments, but there's sort of simple things to do. Even if you've got no nutrition knowledge or very limited nutrition knowledge, you can start to then just ask logical questions to say, well, if it's the case that this person is telling me that carbohydrates spike insulin, that stops the fat burning process. So for that to be true, I could never eat carbohydrates and lose weight. For that to be true. And if you can't actually ever see that being the case, we know that people will lose weight still eating carbohydrates and so on and so forth, provided that you are controlling for calories and so on and so forth. So again, starting to maybe take these statements, these sound bites that you hear on social media, and then just playing that out in your own mind to say, well, okay, if that's true, then what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And then you will logically come to some form of conclusion that probably is going to be the right conclusion. And therefore, I think you can help yourselves before you get yourself tied up in knots about all these various different myths and ideas that get banded around.
Yeah, there's so much of these myths that defy logic. So we've already touched on the clean eating, and now this is the cutting carbs. Like, if you only eat clean, you will lose fat. If you never eat carbs, you will lose fat. So you could do that, and you probably would lose some fat, maybe just some weight, but you would lose something, right? And then eventually you would get to the point where you plateau. So if the key to losing fat is to drop carbs or to eat clean, what do you do when the fat loss stops? You can't drop more carbs from there. Like, you've already dropped all the carbs. If you can't eat any cleaner, like you could wash your food with bleach or something, I guess, but like there's nowhere to go. So logically, like, it just doesn't make sense. And it's why I'm finding it so hard to explain, because like, just to wrap your brain around insulin makes you fat, therefore you can't eat carbs, but what happens when I stop losing fat? Like, what do you do? Like, the answer is to drop calories, but that was the answer all along. Like, logic is just something that people seem to think doesn't apply when you're talking about the human body or talking about science, but it most certainly does in most cases. There's very few things that defy logic. Like I mentioned yesterday, my tendon grew back by itself. That defies logic, but most things with the human body don't defy logic.
I think when it comes to especially the carbohydrate one, like because the fact that when people do cook carbohydrates, there is that initial weight loss that can have nothing to do with fat loss whatsoever. And that convinces people when they hear people talk about fast weight loss, and it's like they cook carbs, they lost weight really quickly. And they just associate weight with fat all the time, weight with fat. And it's really hard to break that in people's minds. And they don't realize that like when you cook carbs, there's like 3 grams of water per gram of carbohydrate. So you're storing that. So as soon as you cook carbohydrates, you lose a whole lot of water weight. That's simply all it is. And that like gives people the impression that going low carb, without it being much stress or strain on them, without having to dramatically change their diet, they're still eating quite a bit, they lose a lot of weight, but they don't realize it's had no impact on their body fat. And as Nick said there, it gets to a point where it stalls. They're increasing the other foods because they're hungry. And then suddenly they either plateau or they start to gain weight again. And the result is they've restricted themselves potentially of a food that they enjoy, so they can sustain that. And then they have to go to a calorie deficit anyway.
All right, so I'm going to crack through a couple of quick questions here, and then we'll come back to a more meaty one. So Erica asks, and I know Erica very well, does it matter if the majority of my nutrition comes from frozen fruits and veg, opposed to fresh? No, it doesn't. Not going to have any compromise to the nutrient density of that food, so you're absolutely fine. I personally use lots of frozen veg in my cooking and things like that, just from a convenience point of view, so you're all good on that front. Question, what are your thoughts on BCAAs? We've covered this a couple of times now, so I won't spend too much time on this one. In the majority of cases, pretty much nonsense. Maybe in some vegan diets where you might want to spike leucine levels or something like that, you might want to do that. Charlotte touched on some stuff yesterday around some specific medical conditions and stuff like that, but that's going to be very, very specific, and you would in those cases have a specific dietitian recommending that for you anyway. So other than that, nope. So we've covered those ones off. Let me go back. I'm sure there's a question on okay, so here we go. Cameron asks, with the case of a hard gainer, someone who struggles to gain weight, should it be more flexible with their diet, considering that person may not have a great appetite? So I guess the question, or the underlying question, is if the person's struggling to gain weight, but they haven't got a good appetite, what may be the solution for that? Maybe Mark, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think, so I mean, so you can be a bit more flexible, so you can have maybe a little bit more junk food just to get an excess bit of calories, maybe? Is that where
I think that's the driver, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, potentially. There could be other ways to try and go around that, though. So to try and maybe keep protein to the lower end of kind of 1.6, 1.5, because a hard gain depends on their training history. But you do get most of your muscle gains from the gym. So you could try and keep satiating foods down quite a bit. And then you can try and go for maybe more liquid calories. I myself I'd be classified as a hard gainer if that's actually a thing. I don't know. But if you could get a lot of your calories through liquid, that'd be a good thing. But yeah, if they want to be a bit more flexible, so they are getting into that extra maybe 200, 300, 400 calorie surplus, by all means, have a donut, have something. But try and not, like Jayne was saying earlier, forget about all the good stuff as well. I think if you can get an optimal diet for, let's say, 80%, just for a round figure, then you can kind of, fill the rest up with how you want. But yeah, I'd say you can be a bit more flexible if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that you've got. It's almost like you adopt some of the reverse strategies that you would have for losing weight. So where you'd say maybe remove liquid calories because that's not going to fill you up. Well, just do the opposite of that. Fill yourself up on liquid calories and things like that. but not neglecting the fact that you still want to have nutrient sufficiency and hitting protein targets and things like that. So being more mindful of that. I also think that, let's say, for example, you're on a 2,500 calorie diet and you can achieve all the nutrients that you need for optimal health and you're hitting all your protein targets within 2,500 calories. And then you up it by 200 calories to try and have a little bit faster weight gain, if that's your goal, then there's nothing wrong with that coming from more calorie dense food because you've already optimized your diet. So food beyond that can be kind of whatever you want, assuming it's...
I'd say another thing as well, hard gainers are notorious for having a high level of NEAT, or even if it's like fidgeting or something, they'll just move a lot more. So even if you take your calories up 200 calories, you might just move an extra 200 calories. So it is actually quite hard to get into that surplus. So I'd kind of focus on the NEAT, which again is completely opposite to what we'd say to people trying to get weight loss. Obviously you don't sit on a sofa all day because that can cause some other issues, but try not to, move around frantically all the time. And just have a look at that. I think they did a study of prison inmates and they said to them, if you gain 5 kilograms or something, or 10 kilograms, have as much food as you want, you can be released early or something. To very low level inmates, I think. And a lot of them struggled because they're eating so much, but as they're eating so much, they had all this energy and they're just moving more. So that's another thing to maybe look at, energy expenditure.
And I guess that sort of leads on to this question, which person's asking, is it the fact that basically a hard gainer is just someone who's got a high daily energy expenditure, meaning that they're not in a calorie surplus? And yes, that could absolutely be if they've got a high step count, they're training lots in the gym, maybe they're expending lots of energy in the gym, maybe just genetically as well, they got a higher BMR. When we calculate BMR with calorie calculators and things like that, it's still just looking at estimations. So you could be within a range of that and slightly higher than somebody else. So there are all those different factors. So basically, if you, again, it comes back to energy balance. If you're not putting on weight over the long period, then it probably suggests you're not in a calorie surplus. So adjust that and keep upping those calories as you go, or maybe walk around a little bit less, whichever is your preference. Everyone's agreeing with your comment, Jayne. Get more awesome by lifting weights. There you go. Cool. Next question comes in. Boom. Hey guys, when dealing with overweight clients, body fat wise, do your calculations for protein and total calories differ than someone that falls within the average scale, as most calculations are based on body weight? I'll open the floor to whoever wants to stick their hand up and go for that one.
Just need to read that one.
So it's basically saying, if you've got a client with high body fat, do you approach protein and total calories differently to someone who is, let's say, relatively lean already in terms of their protein and calories? Or do you just base it off their body weight?
For what's the goal? It depends on the goal, I suppose, but
probably weight loss.
I assume weight loss because of the high overweight client comment.
Yeah. Not much, really. Again, it's going to be down to adherence, but I'd say for most people, if we can kind of hit 1.5 kilograms for their protein or up 1.6, depends if they can adhere to that. Let's say if you're 100 kilograms, I don't think they need to go too high, enough to keep them kind of satiated, and it's not to kind of retain muscle, because if you are that heavy, you are just going to probably lose body fat. You're not going to try and lose muscle instead of body fat. But even if you're kind of 80 kilograms, you're trying to lose a few, I'd probably stick protein at the same time. Calories will differ, because if you're 100 kilograms, your BMR is going to be a lot higher than, let's say, you're 60 kilograms. So obviously that'll difference, and it depends how quick they want to lose that weight. Someone kind of 70 kilograms might only want to maybe create a 500 calorie deficit a day, maybe something even less. Someone at the upper end might be able to go to something a bit more extreme. They might want a quick, 600 to 1,000 calorie deficit. Depends what kind of rate of fat loss. So I think that's very context dependent, unfortunately. But
yeah, I think that just to add to that maybe is that certainly from a calorie perspective, I think the last part of the question is asking about the calculations. Are they based off body weight? So I guess that, you utilize the body weight in the calculation that you make to get to the total calorie point. And then, as Mark is saying, is that based on the person that you have in front of you and their ability to adhere to a specific deficit, based on how you're reading that particular client and their ability to achieve either a small, medium, or large calorie deficit. That is kind of a person-specific thing. But the initial calculation to say, okay, what's maintenance, is based off of the body weight plus a few other different factors, and then the deficit is what's going to be right for that particular person in that particular scenario. How I would approach protein, again, it would be knowing more about that person and how specific we need to be with a protein goal. If they are not necessarily too fussed about building a lot of muscle right now, then again, we can work in broader targets. And I think that, again, it makes, there's some like logic behind, again, that particular person. If they're obese, then you might be getting if you're setting it protein at like 1.8 or whatever, you're going to get a hugely skewed picture of what's necessary in terms of protein. So I think about understanding where that person's at, the specifics of that person, how much excess body fat have they got, what makes logical sense, and then again making some judgment calls based on experience around those different sorts of things. So difficult to give you a hard and fast and saying it's X, Y, Z, but again, that's why we work in ranges. But then even within those ranges, you make adjustments for exceptions in certain cases as well, I would say.
I would add to that as well and say that you could use body fat percentage to work out their lean body mass. So even if you didn't have an exact body fat percentage, if they hadn't done a DEXA or hadn't got it checked, even just from photos, you could probably work out a rough range, even if it's, to the closest 10%. You could probably work out a pretty good range of their body fat percentage, and then using the other part of that percentage. So if they were 30% body fat, that means 70% of them is lean mass, including skeleton or whatever. And then you use that for their protein goal rather than their total body weight, because so calories wouldn't change. Somebody who was 100 kilos and said 30% body fat, and somebody who was 100 kilos and 5% body fat would have very similar calories if you took away their ability to increase NEAT and move around. Like, fat is still active tissue, and the difference between fat and muscle is pretty small. But when you're talking about protein, you can use just the lean body mass if you have a way to work that out, even if it's just rough, because again, like they've already touched on, it doesn't need to be specific for this sort of goal and for this type of client, because they're already fairly overweight. Like, if they're 30% body fat, they probably don't care if they lose, 5 kilos of muscle on their way to losing 30 kilos of fat, and I think, an estimation can be good enough, and that would probably give you a more accurate protein target if, for example, they were a vegan or vegetarian or something that couldn't hit this astronomical target of, 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilo that you might give them if you were using their total body weight.
And John's come in with a question here, which is basically just what you've answered there. Could you use lean body mass for a protein calculation? Yes, you could. I guess the word of caution that Nick mentioned earlier is that, how accurate is that going to be in terms of measuring that body fat percentage? And therefore, again, it depends how critical that is to be accurate with that body fat percentage, which may or may not be the case depending on the person as well. So I'd have a normally measuring of that body fat percentage, but theoretically, if you can get to a rough estimation that's okay for that client, then yes, you could.
Yeah, and I think all these calculations, like you touched on, Simon, they're not an exact science. They're just a starting point. And from that starting point, if you get things a bit wrong or things are going a bit differently to expect, you can change it. You can add in more protein or take a bit of protein away, change the calories. So I think not to overthink for kind of calculation, because it's not exact. It's just a help to get to a starting point. And then it is just kind of trial and error from there.
Yeah, I think that the whole calculator thing is a good point to make. I have my own, but I always say to people when they use it, I often get comments, well, this calculator says this number, this says that number, this says that number. And my response is going to always be that you're always going to get a different number from a different calculation, because they're probably always using slightly different methods of bringing it all together. And I like to think about it as the number that you get from any calculator is just putting you in the ballpark of where you need to be. Now, based on a number of factors about how, your own genetics, or how accurate you've been in inputting some of that information, or how accurate the calculator is in the first place, you could be somewhere near home base, or you could be in row Z of the bleachers, but it's just giving you that start point to say, now I've got a reference point to start. Let's see what happens over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and let's adjust. And then you just keep kind of, as I think we talked about again in one of the talks, is at each point you go down a path of, let's say, for example, weight loss in this context, is you're learning something about yourself, your own body, and the way you are responding to whatever process that you're going through. You're learning something. So if after 2 weeks of that number, you've not progressed in any way, and you've been diligent with calories and things like that, you could say, well, maybe that calculation wasn't quite right. So now I need to make an adjustment. You've learned something. There's nothing wrong necessarily with the calculator, nothing necessarily wrong with the number it gave you. It's just how you then take that information and start to use it wisely is the key thing to think about. There we go. Right. Next question coming in. Cameron. He's got another question. Cameron likes a question. So we like questions. So Cameron, keep on coming. And anybody else who wants to ask a question, feel free. We are live. We are accepting questions as we go. I am going for another gentleman's break. I'm drinking far too much liquid.
All those monsters.
The caffeine is keeping me going, but it's keeping me going to the toilet at the same time. Are refeed days beneficial when cutting during a calorie deficit? And if so, what would be the best approach to it? So I'll leave that to the floor. I'll go on mute.
Cool. I'd say definitely for a lot of people they are. And it's good that you called it a refeed day and not a cheat day, because I think a lot of people can look at a cheat day and think, right, all the rules are out, and have all these negative connotations and think they're doing bad stuff and might feel guilty after it. But refeeds can be very practical. Best way to approach them, you can either have them structured, let's say like every 3 weeks or however long it wants to be, or you can do it around your holidays or social events, anything like that. I'd say rather than just one refeed day, to do it for at least 3 days to kind of get the physiological benefits of maybe kind of leptin, which may become which may be elevated after that 3 days point because it might have been depressed slightly, but also a psychological kind of break. So if you are in a kind of extreme deficit, it's nice to just practice maintenance for a bit, learn new habits, but when you do go back to maintenance. But yeah, I'd say they definitely are beneficial.
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways of doing it, the refeed or the diet break. A refeed is generally short for carbohydrate refeed, and the idea is to replenish muscle glycogen, and then it has these other side effects such as the psychological break and getting closer to maintenance, the lowered stress from the calorie deficit. But sticking to carbohydrates generally means that even if you went over your new calculated maintenance, you would very unlikely put on any fat. You would just replenish your glycogen stores, and then it would get oxidized as energy. If you're looking at a diet break, that might be complete off your diet for X many days, and not tracking if you were already tracking, or I don't know, whatever method you were using that you need a break from, taking a break from it. And that is more like a diet break is more for the psychological reasons and less for the physiological reasons. A refeed would be more so that you could, like Mark already mentioned, raise some of those hormone levels that are lowered and decrease some that are increased, and try and get back to more of a baseline so you can continue dieting and kind of just stave off the adaptive thermogenesis a little bit. It will still happen, but you're kind of, as adaptive thermogenesis starts coming down, you have a refeed and might bump it up a little bit so it's not so far down. And if you just keep doing that, you might be able to diet for a longer period of time without getting to that plateau of adaptive thermogenesis has stopped you from losing weight.
Awesome. And I would just add to that I think that there's a recent study with Bill Campbell from the University of South Florida, which Lane Norton did a post on a couple of weeks ago, and I summarized it on my podcast as well, that looked at either consistent energy restriction over a period of time versus 5 days and then a 2-day refeed. And it shows a slight benefit in terms of fat loss for that 2-day refeed approach. And I would encourage you not necessarily to take that as a soundbite and go and listen to or watch the content that Lane put out about that, because it's not then about, okay, we now all adopt that approach and that's going to be hugely beneficial. There's context and there's things to understand around that. So there is benefit to multiple day refeeds, maybe one on it, a single day on its own, not necessarily hugely beneficial, but I would encourage you maybe to go and have a look at Lane's page or my podcast, obviously, and go listen to that. Cool. Next one. Harrison, again. If you have a client who's overweight and their goal is weight loss, do you need to have a period of time increasing calories to create a metabolism or to create a need for energy before entering a deficit?
No. Your metabolism's already there. You're never creating a metabolism. It's there whether you like it or not. You probably can't even really speed it up or slow it down. Like, it just does what it does based on the inputs that it has, and the inputs are things like your total body weight, how long you've been dieting, how much exercise you do, your activity, your BMR. Like, there's all these factors that make up your metabolism, and they're already there. You don't create it. To raise energy before entering into a deficit, this might just be a case for a refeed or a diet break before continuing a diet. So you would generally do that with someone if you had taken on a client, for example, who had been in a calorie deficit for a long time, whether they came from another coach or a weight loss club or they've been doing it on their own. They've been in a calorie deficit for a long time. You're essentially getting them in a state that's already suffering from adaptive thermogenesis. So to undo that before you start, you may want to increase their calories for a little bit just to try and undo some of that adaptive thermogenesis. But this isn't a quick process. It might take weeks of taking them up to maintenance or even a slight surplus to try and get that adaptive thermogenesis. It'll never be gone. It will always be there, but to minimize it so that you can then start dieting them from their new maintenance, and then go from there. That would be the only case I could really see for it. But essentially, you're just starting working with that client with a refeed or a diet break. It's not a surplus of energy before a deficit for any reason, like getting the body used to having more calories or anything like that. Like, there are real reasons behind it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I do know where that's come from. I saw there's an educator in the industry that I think he hopefully might have changed his mind now, but 5, 6, 7, maybe years ago, he used to say the first thing he used to do with his fat loss clients or comp prep clients would be to bring up the calories to try and lift all their hormones. And it's a very kind of the whole hormone kind of era. But I do think he might have changed his mind. So, but I think obviously that is still running around and Chinese whispers still.
Okay. Cool.
And also the idea of like that you have to be sure that the data you're working with is accurate as well, that there isn't a case of misreporting that the calories you think that person is on is actually the calories that they're on. And that's something to always be conscious of as well. A lot of people can think they're eating very little and they can't lose weight, but they may not be. They may not be like realize how much they're actually eating or the volume of food, or they could be eating without realizing mindlessly. So it's just something to be really conscious of the fact that the data you're working with is accurate before you make any big decisions like that.
Cool. Yeah, I would be, when I take on a new client, I'd be looking at their dieting history if they have it. So if they've been tracking before, for example, you might be able to use that tracking data to come to some conclusions on your own. But even if you've got that, whether you got that or not, taking a new client to maintenance for a while just to eliminate some change, because remember, they're going from not working with you at all to potentially following your training program, the way you write your diets, the way it's presented to them. Like, there's all these things that are changing. Maybe something that shouldn't change straight away is their diet. Like, I know a lot of clients are coming in and they're like, oh, I really need to lose weight for this wedding or whatever they're trying to do. But wherever possible, and like, it's not a hard and fast rule, but wherever possible, I try and take a client to maintenance or calculated maintenance, or if I have more data from them, estimated maintenance, before actually taking them into a deficit or a surplus, so that I have some data that's my own and I'm sure of before I start playing around with these things, purely just for being able to make a more educated decision. Because as a coach, every decision we make, unless we've worked with someone for a very, very, very long time, is an educated guess. It might be a very well-educated guess, but it still is to an extent. And the more education you can get in that, the better the guess will be.
Cool. Right. We're going to take 2 more myths and kind of close that off, and then we'll kind of close the loop on this particular chat. Just one more that I'm going to cover off very, very quickly. Erica says, does body type, ectomorph, endomorph play a factor in losing fat? I think that the quote that Dr. Mike put out on his Instagram, which was based on his talk from yesterday, which was related to coronavirus, I think would actually still apply here, in the sense that genetics may play a role in what happens in terms of weight loss and how quick and how it all operates and things like that. But it doesn't change the principle of what you're actually going to do. So you are going to still have to be in a calorie deficit and follow those core principles, albeit genetics may play a role in how fast and what you kind of do with your things like that. But essentially it doesn't change your actions and how you approach weight loss, I would say. So there you go. So we're going to go to Jayne. Jayne, your final one for this talk. Let's come back to maybe a little coronavirus topic. Immune boosting foods and supplements. Is there such a thing? Should we stock up on blueberries and stuff like that?
Those superfoods, yeah. Immune boosting supplements or food. No, there is no, this is something that's really clickbaity right now. Anytime there's any kind of crisis like this, or like with COVID-19, there's like people putting out that these superfoods and supplements are going to supercharge your immune system and things like that. It's pure clickbait. There's nothing to it. When it comes to your immune system, it is developed over time. It's going to be a product of choices you've made throughout your life, nutritionally, choices you've made within your lifestyle. It's also going to be if there's no pre-existing conditions that may compromise your immune system. All these factors over time are what's going to influence where your immune system is at. Now, there are things that we can do to improve our immune function and to support its health. And I think that's the really important thing. We can't supercharge it. You're not going to take a magic pill and suddenly bulletproof your immune system. This isn't a fast track like so many things. It's something that you need to support over time. So yeah, right now you can start taking measures and promote, like optimizing it and supporting it. Like things that are going to be really important when it comes to your immune system and immune function are sleep. Like I'm constantly going on about sleep to people, and sleep is like cornerstone to every parameter of your health, and I cannot reiterate that enough. Like it will help with everything, and it has got a really, really big impact on your immune system. So prioritize trying to get 7 to 9 hours sleep a night. That's really going to be supportive of your immune function. Then tying in with sleep, stress management. And right now for everyone, this is a really stressful time, and stress will have an impact on your sleep for one, but also elevated cortisol does compromise your immune system, especially if your stress levels are quite chronic and it's like continuous. Like you can be functionally stressed. Our body doesn't really differentiate between all the different types of stress that it's under, and stress will impact your cortisol levels, and stress will impact your immune system. Like you have to think about with stress, like a good example would be like when you're really stressed, like fight or flight hormone, like mode, you get really strong, you can get really fast, you're not thinking, like you're really on the ball, you're really heightened. But when you are that way, your immune function actually drops, because if you think of the hunter-gatherer days and back in the day when we had to escape from something, yeah, you needed to be fast, but you didn't need to be able to heal immediately. So I think that's a really good example of like that your immune system drops when you stress. So imagine if you're chronically stressed, you're constantly stressed out. So it's really important, particularly right now, I think it's really, really apt is that you work on your stress management however you can. So that will help knock on, you get better sleep. So things like meditation. This may be the perfect time to start working on meditation. Even simple things like breathing drills. There's a fantastic one called box breathing that can be really calming. You can Google that, or I can post something about it later. You know, really learn to manage your stress. Even journaling. Any tools that you can find that help calm you down can be really, really helpful. And this will stand to you long term as well. Like I know we spoke about protein and having numerous other functions beyond just muscle gain. Protein is actually very supportive to your immune function as well. That is one of its other functions, and it's a pretty darn important function as well. So make sure you are getting sufficient protein. Optimize your micronutrients, veggies, fruit, get those vitamins and minerals in, get your fiber in. A healthy, balanced diet is going to support your immune function as well. And then long-term dieting. If right now you're under a lot of stress and you are in an extreme calorie deficit, do consider the fact that if you are in a calorie deficit and dieting long-term, it does have a bit of an impact on your immune function as well. It's not optimal to support it. So if you are finding that you're under a lot of stress right now and feeling a lot of pressure, it may be time to kind of increase your calorie intake a little bit, consider more maintenance if you want to maintain it well. Then in relation to supplements, I'd say get your bloods done if you're like concerned with deficiencies in anything. But a lot of the recurring supplements that we recommend are going to come into play here again, like omega-3, be it from oily fish, or if you get it from algae, if you're going to supplement, you know, EPA and DHA, try and target, if you're not eating oily fish, about 1 gram of combined EPA and DHA a day. Really important. That's going to help support a healthy immune system. Then another one is vitamin D3, which we can't really get from food. It's really difficult, and we don't get a lot of sunshine in Ireland and the UK. And vitamin D3 does support a healthy immune system. And there's actually been, for anyone who wants to have a look, some fantastic research just came out of Trinity College here in Ireland recently on vitamin D3 and it being quite supportive in helping people in recovering from COVID-19 and in supporting your immune function around that. It's not a magic pill yet again. It's not going to be for everyone, but it's like there is some positive data there. So definitely get on vitamin D3 now. I'd highly recommend it. And even in general, like October, March in particular, it's a good idea. And then I would say another thing to look at, potentially vitamin C, like make sure you get it, and make sure you get enough of it in your diet. With vitamin C and zinc though, it doesn't really prevent getting like colds and things like that, but it does accelerate recovery in some of the research. So that's another consideration. So yes, you cannot boost your immune system, you cannot fast track it, but you can support it. And if you don't do all of those things or some of those things, get started now and try and take care of it and take care of yourself overall, your overall health, but ignore any clickbait.
Awesome. Cool. We're going to take one more myth. Well, it's not really a myth. This, I think, is a question. It's currently a huge question because it's blocking 2 people out of the screen. I'll ask it and then I'll remove it so you can actually Mark and Jayne. Hey guys, on the topic of calorie deficits and maintenance, what's your advice on personal trainers and their role in giving nutritional advice? From a legal point of view, no matter how much personal research and knowledge I've built around nutrition, I'm not legally qualified to give out this advice, although I aim to get those qualifications. Any advice on how to tiptoe around this until then? And back with them.
Cool. It's a tough one. In a lot of personal training qualifications, they should touch on nutrition, albeit pretty terrible and very quick. But with that, you are technically allowed to give nutritional advice. You can't give any prescriptive kind of guidance. Not even nutritionists should be doing that. But you can give. I don't know if I should be saying this on live, so I'm not going to say actually. But you can give very light advice, and one way to do it would be maybe if I was in your case, then maybe I'd be doing these things. However, what I would probably do is refer out. There's no kind of shame in referring out to someone. I refer out constantly because we don't know everything at all. scrape the surface of nutrition. So referring out is really good, but I'd also encourage getting those qualifications as quick as you can. But there's no harm in giving very gentle nutrition advice as long as you know it is evidence-based, because then you can't be doing any harm. But yeah, the first thing you should be thinking is do no harm. But yeah, it's a tough
one. Charlotte yesterday, she fielded a question about renal function and protein and stuff like that. And immediately she said, out of scope of practice, you'd have to go to a renal dietitian and things like that. Now, that's obviously an extreme case and things like that, but it is the point of knowing the limits of where your scope of practice is, and not being ashamed that then you do refer someone, because you are taking their health and their progress that's at the forefront of your mind, rather than any feeling of any embarrassment that you don't necessarily know the answer immediately. So never feel ashamed, like Mark says, of referring out if you need to. I think that we would all do that. Again, we know the limitations, and when it comes to the extent of our nutritional scope of practice. So for example, going into dealing with people with eating disorders and things like that, that's a very much a specialized area. You're really going to immediately stop giving advice at that point. And if you find out that piece of information, and then you're going to refer to the relevant person who specializes in that. So be confident about referring. That's showing that you have that person's health and their care on the forefront of your mind. And I think that they would thank you for it long term. So always have a client.
I think if you can confidently refer out better than you can confidently answer a question, then you definitely refer out. Like as everyone said, there's no shame in it at all. I refer out to other nutritionists all the time, purely because I might not be the best fit. Like, I primarily deal with performance nutrition. So if someone comes to me and, one of many factors means that we're not a good fit, I just refer out to another good nutritionist that I know. And then, if I do that enough times, they might get a performance case that they're not comfortable dealing with, and they might send it back. But the whole thing is to stay within the scope of what you legally can do. But then just because you legally can do something doesn't mean you should do it. Someone messaged me this morning outside of this. They were like, I want to do my PT qualification. I'm going to become a coach. And I was like, doing a PT qualification makes you qualified, doesn't make you a coach. Like, just because you are educated to do something doesn't mean you have the skills to do it. And just because there's a piece of paper in one of my folders over there that says I'm a nutritionist doesn't mean that, if a question came up about something I'm not comfortable answering, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I know the answer or try and figure out a way around it. I'm just going to be like, hey, I don't know that. That's not in the scope of stuff that I normally deal with, and it's not an area of my expertise. And that's not a shameful thing at all. There's literally like tens of people speaking at COVID-19 who can probably answer some questions better than I can. And they're the people that maybe you need to go to for an answer on a certain thing. But if you're not qualified, definitely don't do it. Even if you are qualified, still think about whether you are enough of an expert in that field to give the advice that they're asking for.
Awesome. Cool. Right, we come to the end of this particular talk. So thank you, Jayne. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mark. As always, these guys have given a lot of value over the course of the last hour and 23 minutes. So make sure you follow them on Instagram. Make sure you say thank you to them. Make sure you give them a bit of love, whether it is in social media, wherever it is that you want to show them love or whatever. Yeah, Jayne, your name's below, not above us.
No, I was thank you and give you love.
Yeah,
I do that.
Thank you.
I was being nice.
As always. Cool. So thank you very much, guys. Speak to you very, very soon, I'm sure. Thanks for your time, and we will see you all later.
Speak to you soon.
Geez, that was a lot of info. And as you could tell, during the talk, I was also learning. You see, I'm not naive enough to think that I know everything, and I know that I'm going to be learning for the duration of my career and probably even longer. I find it's really important to stay in touch with other coaches who are experts in their area of the industry. If you want to find out anything more about any of the great coaches in this video, their information is in the description below. Speaking of below, if you have any questions, chuck them in the comments down there. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you like me, maybe consider subscribing. Until next time, I've been Nick, this has been Nicktrition, and I'll see you in the next video. Was that good? Yeah, that's fine.